säga något intressant.
All right, I'm gonna kick us off then. So welcome to the first Heroes of Data Roundtable. Super exciting to be here. So a quick kind of recap what we are doing. Heroes of Data Roundtable is about sharing ideas for how we, as data professionals, can use an engineering mindset to improve communication with business stakeholders, both technical and non-technical, and possibly even with each other. And this is the first episode. My name is Sara Landfors. I work with marketing at Validio, which is a data quality platform. And my other hat, which is where I'm here today, is that I'm responsible for the Heroes of Data community. And I'm joined today by 3 community members. And I would like to ask you to introduce yourselves. Johannes, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. I'm Johannes Jansson. I am a data engineer, currently working as head of data for Joint Academy, which is a digital healthcare provider based in Malmö. I have a daughter at home. She's 11 months old, so I'm very focused on that as well as my job right now. I'm super excited to be here. I haven't been part of the Heroes of Data before, but I've heard good things about the community and I'm excited to be a part of it.
Thanks for joining, Johannes. And Ylva, do you want to go next?
Yes. So my name is Ylva Lundegård. I work as a data engineer, developing Motherbrain at EQT. I have a background in large-scale software development, esports, and consulting. And also super excited to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Cool.
What about you?
Thank you.
I am also a data engineer. I am the third of the data professionals. I hope to be a somewhat more permanent fixture on this roundtable than others, but Sara might be, plotting and scheming to push me out already. I work as a technical lead at Budbee for about 8 more days, and then I'm off to do other things. My specialization is in the software engineering side of data engineering, so a lot of platform stuff, and I used to be an embedded engineer, so my love of bytes is far greater than my love of advanced analytics.
Cool. Thank you all for being here. And Yi, you and I have been plotting how we're going to do this Heroes of Data Roundtable. And the plan is that you will share what we call today's entirely hypothetical scenario. And then we will have a discussion about that. So if you don't mind, would you please take us through the entirely hypothetical scenario?
All right, will do. I will read it verbatim, but I will try to do so quickly. It is very short, and it's obviously based on true stories, but obviously not true stories that any one of us 3 here has shared or can recognize in any way. So this is a story about someone who wanted the head of their business units to understand that we have a lot of low-quality components in our data platform, and they were causing issues such as increased turnover time for analysts as well as developers and increased costs. And if we would say that was me, then maybe I had a discussion with the head of my business unit, and I told him that we have 3 messaging services hooked up to one app with 4 syncs. This means that our data is quadrupled in size before anything happens to it whatsoever. 2 ETL services running on the 4 syncs, each writing to several destinations that are then read by the other ETL service. So cross dependencies everywhere, and different sets of business logic, and so forth and so forth. Turnover time is weeks. Everyone is crying and sweating, and so forth. And there was this meeting, and then I talked this over with my reasonable head of business. And an hour later, it was decided that we would implement 6 new dashboards and look at the technical debt in Q2 of 2027 at the very latest. And so when I went home to start my drinking for the evening, the head of my business unit is not stupid. I thought to myself, he has a fancy degree and expensive loafers. What could I possibly do about this entirely hypothetical situation? What would you guys do?
I've been very fortunate not being in exactly this situation, but that doesn't mean I haven't experienced tech debt. Like in general, I would say that management has been really good understanding what tech debt is, but like that doesn't mean that it hasn't occurred. And even if I would get time for it, it's not fun for anyone, and no one wants to do it. But basically, I think I would ask if all of these messaging services are needed. Otherwise, remove it. I have maintained a lot of things without questioning if we really need them. And I think we could save a lot of time if we really asked ourselves, what is the purpose of this feature? Could we simplify it or otherwise rewrite it?
All right, so let me ask you right back then. So in this case that you're presenting, it sounds as though your experience with tech debt is that it is often surface level and or well monitored, so to speak. You're talking about removing unneeded features, but what if you have a whole ecosystem built on top of those features, as flawed as they are and so forth? Is that your experience, that that's not usually the case?
No, definitely. You definitely have things that's, of course, core and definitely have needed the attention and us fixing the problem, really. I think a lot of the times it has come to that because we haven't had any clear ownership of that specific feature. So like we have let it be for a very long time. And no one felt the ownership and mandate to actually like continuously build on that feature, and eventually the code becomes stale and very hard to develop. And I feel like especially when we like haven't had good tests, also documentation. It sounds super boring, but it's so important. And without good tests, it's hard to also rebuild it. Know that you're not breaking anything. So I think that when we haven't had tests, it's been really, really hard. And we have had definitely times when we had to pay back the debt by definitely building the whole feature. And it's been expensive. It has. Yeah. But what do you, Johannes? Do you recognize?
Yeah, I think not going as much into the technical, but more the human side of things. I really like how you ended that, Jacob, not by drinking, but by thinking about your stakeholders as persons with a fancy degree. That's something that I think is really important. It's so easy to get stuck on this superficial level where you feel like this misunderstood genius. You know how things should be done, you know what level things should be on, you know how important testing is, you know how annoying it is to have different sets of business logic, duplicated data flows and stuff like that. And it's easy to just get grumpy and maybe not start drinking, but getting that approach. I think it's so important to try to humanize your stakeholders or your manager or whoever it was you were discussing with in this scenario. And you're starting to think about like, how do I explain to him or her what this is really about? Because to me, I mean, and to all of us, and probably to most listeners as well, obviously having a quadrupled amount of data is horrible, and having a duplicated business logic or even conflicting business logics within the same system is just a nightmare, something you should avoid. But maybe that doesn't mean that much for someone who's not into data, who just wants numbers to add up. So I think my first step towards buying myself more mandate, I guess, to even get into the technical things would be to start talking about like, so what does this mean? So having quadruple data, that means an increased cost for storage. It means an increased hosting fees. More importantly, it probably means more work hours for the team, 4 times as many things to support, having to have everything up to scale. And just trying to put that in numbers as well. Like, so we could be doing almost twice as much work if we didn't have this system. So by spending this amount of time to redo it or make it better, this is the actual gain in man hours we could get. Another thing that I think is really difficult is to get into like the risk of making mistakes, and it's something I'm practicing a lot currently. Like explaining and even trying to quantify and assess like what's the risk of us making a mistake now when we have these different business logics. How much time are we spending trying to hunt down discrepancies that appear? So I think that could be a fun direction to take this conversation as well. Like, how do we communicate? Because they do have fancy degrees and expensive loafers, and they're usually pretty clever as well.
Yeah, and maybe because when we discussed doing this roundtable, we were kind of saying a little bit, you maybe represent more of the like technical data engineer, and maybe I'm closer to kind of a business stakeholder. And I definitely agree with you, Johannes, that the communication is super important because, and I would like to add into the mix, you're saying like, oh, try to quantify like the impact instead of talking about quadruple data. talk about what's the impact that the quadruple data is going to have. But if you want to take it even one step further, I would recommend figure out what your business stakeholder really cares about. Like, do they care about the team size? Do they care about cost optimization? What is the business KPI that they are worried about? And then express the technical debt in terms of implications for that metric. And it sounds, Ylva, like what you describe is a team of management who already understand that quite well, I guess. So yeah, does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it does, definitely. And I like that point, definitely. To definitely ask yourself, like, what is the most important part of this feature? Like you said, what are we optimizing for? Is it cost? Is it like time from the feature arrival, or is it whatever? And from that, start to like think about what do we need to do, and what do we need to communicate, and what's most important, and etc.
So an eye-opener for me personally some months ago was when I was in a conversation that was basically about this very topic with other data professionals, and I just kept hearing this term data literacy being bounded around, and it was a bit frustrating for me because after a while it kind of dawned on me that okay, these are also clever people, but on my side of the table, so to speak, clever engineers, but they have not stopped to figure out whether they are business literate, while they keep thinking about ways to make the business stakeholders, the other side, more data literate. But if you want to take like a marriage counselor view on this, you might say that, okay, so that is a problem. Data literacy or literacy in tech in general is, that's going to be a problem, right? But which of the problems can you fix? It's much easier for you as the kind of aggrieved party, the frustrated person in this scenario. It's much easier for us to try to understand, what can I do? What can I understand? And I think bringing the KPIs up, the particular KPI that you're working on, is kind of a great point. If this is like a point that has not been made clear to the data professional, me or whoever, then I might ask next time, like, okay, so it seems like we're talking about this for a while now. It seems like we're getting stuck on this particular point. What exactly are we doing right now? Like, how would you prioritize things currently? And that might give some sort of insight, if not insights into how you might not leave that meeting and go, oh, okay, I don't need to work on tech debt, but it might give you some sort of insight into, okay, how can I present this? What are the actual issues that I have right now? Okay, but I can't implement the things that you were talking about. That's because of things. That's kind of another thing I've noticed with business stakeholders, and kind of the core of the question here is whether debt is even a reasonable metaphor for it. Is it the right word to use? Because with debt, you start thinking about costs. Like if you have a factory, you want a new machine, you might put yourself in debt to get the new machine, and that's fine if you can increase productivity. But technical debt has another side, and that is enablement. If we have technical debt, low quality components, that disables us from building the things we want. It's more akin to the factory having a bottleneck where the trucks enter and leave or something. If you want to talk about fixing that, you would talk about what it cost, but the bottleneck itself is not the debt. The debt is something else. It's pertaining to this, but it's not the same thing. So I think that's probably a solid recommendation from the business side then, that maybe look at the KPIs and figure out, okay, but what out of this is now impossible? What becomes possible tomorrow if you let me work on this?
Yeah, I really like that. Sorry, I'll go ahead. So I really like that talking about the depth metaphor. But before, I just want to get into KPI things a bit more, because what could really motivate both business people and engineers would be to make it measurable. Just to make sure that we're actually, if we are tracking our KPIs accurately as we should be, if we can set up, I don't know if we're using initiatives or OKRs or something, then we can make it very practical, and especially for data people, knowing that like what we're doing, what we're impacting is actually moving that needle somehow, is probably very motivating, and makes it easier for both stakeholders and for people like us to be motivated at working at something. We are objectively measuring the value we are creating. So it's not just about explaining, it's also about tracking it during the work on reducing the tech debt. And I think that in itself could motivate people quite a lot. And then on the flip side, bringing like the business, basically the reason why we are okay with the tech debt and bringing that back to our team. It's a very much us and them metaphor now, but that's how it goes. Like I think it's one thing to say, well, we have to have these 4 separate pipelines because stakeholders are stupid and they don't understand us, which will make for a horrible morale and least a horrible time altogether. But understanding like, well, the company is in a situation right now where we have to take these risks in order to reach this goal, and it's for people to understand why we're taking on the risk we are doing and why we have to prioritize something else is probably really helpful as well. So maybe not changing the output that much, but just changing the mindset of us when we have to struggle with tech debt and when we have to accept it and postpone it into 2027. Just understanding why is probably really powerful.
Yeah, I love both of those points, Johannes. A question, you talked about measurement. Do you have some examples of how that could be done?
Like for us, like I guess something that a lot of people are working on is moving towards real-time reporting and having data flowing rather than being pulled. So when Yi and I actually worked for the same. I'm actually Yi's predecessor at Joint Academy, so we can probably relate to some of the things we're talking about. But we're still running some hourly ETL jobs, and then we wanted to move those to be bi-hourly instead, so twice per hour. And then so one of the things we would track would be like how long does the ETL actually take, and then while we were speeding things up, moving towards an EL rather than an ETL pipeline, we could see that number go down, and we had that on a dashboard, and we could track like how much closer to having real-time reporting are we really. And that was something that both stakeholders and people in my team, or me back then, I guess I was alone, really appreciated, and just having that thing to work towards. I guess that could be one example of setting up something measurable and real-time trackable.
I like that. And how would you then connect that to tech debt? If we for now use that word, and then we can discuss if we have other terms for it. How would you kind of use that measurement then in working with your stakeholder in the expensive loafers?
Yeah, so if we just take this example with having like the 4 times the data, that would probably mean that we're further from having real-time reporting, and one way and then we could just track, well, now all of our reports are lagging 2 hours behind. We think that if we could reduce this to having only 2 separate pipelines instead, we should be able to have an hourly report instead. And then we could track the time the report is taking and start working on simplifying, and I'm guessing incrementally remove one of these 4 data flows and then remove another one. And while we're doing these small steps, we will see that we're getting closer and we're reducing the amount of lag in our reports. I guess that would be the easiest thing to track. What's more difficult to track, and what I would really like to get into more, would be like the risk of making mistakes. Also tracking the amount of time things take, I think it's very difficult. I think it's annoying to be too strict on counting like man hours and how much time different things take. But something we've done as well is that we've been tracking how much time does it take from being asked to add a new feature in the BI database to actually having it out in production. And that's something we've tracked by just seeing like for how long time does the Trello card or the Jira card lay in ongoing, and working on our processes to try to speed up that process.
Yeah, nice. So like feature velocity, is that?
Yeah,
I feel like that's a word I've heard. Yeah. No, that's very.
I haven't heard that word, but that sounds like a very good word. So that would be one way of quantifying like the amount of work this takes for the team. If we can show that our feature velocity is going up, that probably means that we're doing something right in reducing tech debt. But it's difficult to quantify those things. I mean, it's easy to quantify AWS costs, but it's difficult to quantify man hours, or even how people feel at the office, like the energy we have going into work, stuff like that.
So one thing that we did regarding that was that, sure, we can quantify things. We can start trying to put this into terms that are easier to create, business decisions around. But another thing that we did was to say that, okay, we have all these alerts from the system. And the alerts typically only go to the data engineers. And the data engineers get, you wake up, you open your laptop, you delete 1,000 emails from the automatic alerting system, kind of like that. Then we figured, okay, but what if we parse those? And what if we present those to the stakeholders? So now they have a little box on their dashboards, which is like today's catastrophic data failures. Because that, even though it's not quantifiable in any way, it does help drive the discussion. Because someone is going to wonder, instead of wondering, oh, where's my data? I'll ask the data team to fix it. That's their job. One might say, okay, do we have a lot of catastrophic failures? Are these really catastrophic? And you have the opportunity to say, yes, indeed, these are catastrophic. And this is, in fact, not a data team issue. This is another team or so and so. You can have a much more direct discussion if it's proactive, rather than them coming to us and us saying, oh, but it's not our fault, like going into some sort of defensive mode immediately. That's not as useful. So maybe democratize the alerts a bit. They don't want 1,000 emails, but they can absolutely have like a latest report or a weekly digest of everything that was horrible in the data community this week at the company. That does help a lot. It helps create understanding that, okay, they don't have a lot of feature turnaround right now, but on the other hand, this little box is red all day.
Like creating visibility around like the day-to-day work and the reality and things like that. Are there other ways of doing that? Like Ylva or Johannes, if you have other ideas for how to generate that, like almost storytelling, like you said, Johannes, like what's the feeling of working in the data team when we have all of this tech debt?
I feel like one thing that helped us a lot is making sure that our Jira board is open to everyone. So when someone puts in a data request, they see our actual backlog and they understand why we're prioritizing things the way they are being prioritized. I think that's really good. Another thing is like using open Slack channels where we communicate openly about the issues that we are having, and that's a pretty good way to get like the vibe of the team somehow. But I really like Yi's idea as well about like quantifying the number of error messages and just having those visible. There is a risk of getting into like the business work culture where we're just trying to show how annoying things are and how busy we are. But like if we want people to understand what we're going through, we have to make it visible to them in some way.
Like the positive spin to put on it would be, rather than saying, oh, we have this many error messages, you would just say, today there is a data outage. We expect it to be done by 2 o'clock. Then they feel, oh, they thought of me. They presented me with, okay, I have to do something else until 2 o'clock. Yeah. Their day becomes easier. So it doesn't become this little nagging, like, hey, look how busy we are. I'm sweating down here. It's more like, hey, well, for your consideration, you might want to take some other meeting or whatever, because your dashboard isn't going to work.
Yeah, definitely. And I also try to explain the issue as good as possible and try to explain like why it's taking time, like it's on a good level, and taking the time rather than just saying like, no, it's down prioritized because, and then be more transparent in why that is, and so that we are prioritizing this over this, but we plan to make this at this time. Transparency in general, then how you reach it is hard, but
well, that's again kind of going back to the marriage counselor metaphor. That's obviously step one. I feel like this when this happens.
But I don't like it either. The errors. No one likes them.
And I think something I've been practicing a lot since I was promoted to head of data is to like owning your mistakes and not trying to hide mistakes. So whenever we had a billing issue where we missed out on some revenue, and it's so tempting to just like try to shove it under the rug and be like, oh, there was a mistake, but that doesn't really matter, and I mean we can figure it out. But it's better to just like do the black box. Is that what we call it? I think postmortems. Do the postmortems, post them publicly, try to explain and understand like why things are happening, because I think that's really key, especially when it comes to tech debt, still a weird metaphor, but like explaining like this happened because of this, and if we would have done it this way instead, we probably would have reduced the risk of it. So doing that and owning the mistakes, owning the decisions that were made, and making that very clear to everyone, rather than, because I think most engineers are really prone towards just fixing things themselves and not communicating too much about it. So I think that's also in the spirit of transparency and democracy, to own your mistakes and be clear with your postmortems.
Definitely.
All right. So I've been thinking, obviously, for weeks and weeks now, like, okay, so what is a better metaphor? And then I had a discussion quite like this one with a friend this morning, and I think we came to something. If you want to hear it and say that's the dumbest thing we've ever heard, or something else. So what we decided on was that possibly, at least, a better wording would be technical readiness, to talk about your capacity to meet a challenge, rather than saying, okay, we have this debt. That's a word that's easy to misconstrue. It's a negative word. It's kind of hard to understand what it really entails. But if you really want to look at the kind of how well does our factory operate side, rather than what does our factory cost side, then readiness is a quite okay word. And you'd come into meetings and say, oh, we would like to use the third quarter of this year to improve technical readiness. That has quite a lot more, I feel, impact than, say, reduce tech debt. Okay, by how much? Debt is quantifiable. Readiness is not, but it is understandably useful to have readiness. So maybe that's
Definitely.
I like that a lot.
I like it.
And it connects very clearly to the feature velocity. It's like, if you're more ready, then you can have higher feature velocity. Or what do you
Yes.
think? You are the practitioners here. Do you agree?
No, but definitely. We have done a lot of those things, like when we say paying off debt, but that in the end, doing what we thought would be major things, in the end, it's just changing a couple of lines. That's saying that we are very ready is a better word than saying we have very little debt.
Yeah, I like it. I like that it captures, like, being low in readiness captures this crippling feeling of not really being able to catch up, because being in debt is annoying, and it's like you're tying your own hands. I personally, I quite like the negative connotation of tech debt. It's a scary word, and sometimes it's useful to maybe it's just like my cynicism, or like the engineering whiny mindset, but I also quite like the fact, I mean, everyone knows that debt is something you have to repay, or you will go bankrupt, and it has negatives with it.
Not business people, because businesses
Yeah,
don't
I was
work
gonna
like that.
say, actually, I think that's the thing, and I don't have a business degree per se, but I probably have more of a business degree than, a data engineering degree, where, you talk about ROI, like return on investment, where basically like, oh, but, if we take on like 2 million in debt, but it gets us back like 5 million in the end, like after 3 years, then that debt is totally okay. And it's okay for us to have that debt for 5 years until
And then you can take 2
2027.
million more.
Exactly. And I think, I think that might actually not be true, that it has a negative connotation in all like circles. And I think that's a little bit what you were saying in the beginning too, Yi, that like maybe it's the wrong word for that particular purpose of communicating with business stakeholders.
Well, I think so, because that was one of the original thoughts, I think, that we had way back when, was that, but business people, they operate like this. A modern business works like that. You take on debt. Well, but that's not to say anything negative. It's just how market economics work. You take on debt, you expand your operations to cover that debt and more, but then you don't really repay it. That's something enormous companies do. Then you're from startup to scale up, take on more debt, more investors, more loans, expand even more. Nations work like this as well. If you want to go there, like China and the US have debt to each other that they have absolutely zero intention of ever repaying, because that's just not how it works. So I don't personally think that's the kind of wholesome engineering mindset. Like, yes, you take a loan, but since the loan has overhead in form of costs, you pay down the loan. And then
No, but I mean, yeah, I'm thinking devil's advocate a little bit here, but I think basically, let me phrase this correctly. Yeah. So no one pays back all of their debt, or most people don't pay back all of their debt, and that's true for engineering as well. And it's not like we don't want any debt at all. Like I guess maybe it would be nice to always be able to write every feature to perfection with no bugs ever. But I mean, even engineers take shortcuts all the time, and we are also playing the debt game. We would never get anything done unless we started by taking debt, and then once the debt interest rates is getting higher because it's bogging us down, then we start repaying it, but then we take on new debt. So it's not like we want to remove all tech debt either, right? We're playing the same game as engineers, as the business people, or as the nations.
very
So
true.
yeah, maybe repaying the debt isn't the way to see it.
No, but they manage debt. That's what nations and business people do. They manage debt.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, and so do we, I guess. Then I guess the issue is that we have to live with the consequence of the debt a lot more in engineering than the business people do, and that's where something like Readiness would highlight that a bit more. But I guess the solution to, like, if we want to stay with the debt metaphor, is just, as we said, transparency and democracy, like trying to share the pain of being in debt that we experience, is like making sure that those drawbacks of each particular piece of tech debt that we have.
So I have a question then. How do you know? So it sounds like, you have tech debt, it's fine, like it's growing like this, and then you hit the point where it's not fine, and we need to actually do something about it. So 2 questions: how do you know when that is? And secondly, how do you communicate then to your stakeholders that, okay, we've actually like shifted now, and now we're on the wrong side, and now we need to repay? How would you think about that?
Good question. I think one of the very visible sign is that no one wants to touch it. It's like been there for so long, and no one dares. No, everyone is scared of this part. And how to communicate it. I think it comes back to what we talked about before. Being transparent, asking yourselves, like, what are we trying to solve? What are we optimizing for? What do we really need? And look at things as how fast can we iterate on new features, on new stuff, and try to be as transparent and communicative as possible.
Yeah, I like that you're highlighting both aspects of debt or low readiness. What's the negative of tech readiness, G? Low readiness?
Low tech
unready.
Low tech
unreadiness.
But
technical
the way
obstacles, perhaps.
Technical obstacles. But that's how I see it as well. There are two sides to it. One is the more subjective side, like how do we feel about working with this, but also objective, of course, like how much it is slowing us down. And the other one would be like the actual risks to the company, the risk of making mistakes, the actual costs. So like it's, if some piece of tech debt is taking us twice as much time, well, maybe we could just get more people. Maybe if you get 3 times more people, we could live with this tech debt, and our company is in a situation where we can handle this. So we have these 2 different levers, or these 2 different aspects. So one is in my team that I'm responsible for, that I have to communicate very, very clearly. But then the other one is the business side, with the risks and how much money we can afford to throw on a problem, or how many hours we can afford to throw. And then I guess it will always have to be an honest conversation between me and the loafer guy, where we honestly try to understand each other's perspectives and honestly reach some kind of agreement on this is the level of tech readiness that we need right now. Right. And we both have to be willing to compromise.
Yeah, very good. Very good summary almost, I think, Johannes. I was going to do a little bit of a recap now, but before we wrap things up, do you have any, like Ylva or Johannes or maybe do you have any final things to add that you think are important to mention when we talk about tech debt or tech readiness?
Oh, I think it was a good ending.
Cool. All right. So basically, I think what we landed in, and correct me if you disagree here, is that it has a lot to do with communication, both in terms of communicating what are the targets for the business that we're actually solving for, are we doing the right things, what are actually the implications of tech debt, and maybe even thinking specifically about the language that we use. So is tech debt really the right word, or do we need to use something else? And then communicating not only the numbers or the hard facts, but also like the softer aspects of, this is now at a point where it's so bad that nobody wants to touch this, etc. So I would say those are kind of the key highlights. Yi, do you want to fill in something? Did I miss any key points?
No, not at all. I just want to take the opportunity to say thank you both for joining us and for having a discussion that was even lovelier than we would have anticipated.
Thank
I
you.
agree. Thank you so much, Ylva and Johannes. Fantastic. Thank you.